fly them in. And dogs have been gone a couple days at this point, and it appears as though private planes were probably used to get these people out so quick. They put them on the ground, and the dogs start searching. And nobody can believe what the dogs are doing. They're walking north, but they're not walking a little north. They're going way north. They're headed straight into this high peaks area, super rugged, difficult even for the trackers to keep going through this area. And they walk up to one of the highest peaks in that area, over the top, and they keep going through swamps, through boulder fields, through everything. Eventually, they get to the western side of the city of Lake Placid, but they're on the perimeter of the town in the hills or mountains surrounding it. And the dogs go all the way around the perimeter of the town and back down the other side. And that's where they walk up to this giant swamp, and the dogs sit down, and that's it. Everyone kind of stops. And the search and rescue people couldn't believe it, but they said, hey, they are 100% positive the dogs were on the scent. And it was an unbelievable, almost 30-mile perimeter that they walked, and they couldn't believe that they were still on it for a little 8-year-old boy. And there's no way that they thought that the boy could have survived going up and down these mountains, because they figured it had to have taken them a week or more to make this round, because that's what it was taking them every day. They didn't make this quickly. It was a hard path. And it's one of those searches that everyone was dumbfounded. Well, at the time that the search teams were called out from California, this is one of the only other times I've ever heard this, Green Berets come out. Green Berets land. Green Berets set up their own camp, and they start searching on their own. Don't talk to anybody. They're working through the wilderness on their own. So part of this that the listeners need to understand is that the Green Berets are different than National Guards people. National Guardsmen come from your community. They're local folks. Green Berets come from all over the nation, and they're trained differently. And they have a vast majority of them have secret clearances. So they're not going to say anything. They're not going to talk to anybody, and they're going to go about and do their job. So whatever their mission was, other than to find Dennis, who knows, because they didn't talk to anybody. And they weren't working with other searchers, just like in Dennis's case. They were working alone, through the forest, by themselves. And that just doesn't fit with what you think about search and rescue teams. And when I talked about this at the conference this year, people couldn't believe it. They've never heard of something like this, where groups weren't working together to find somebody. It's as though they were on their own private mission that no one understood. The reality of that is, I don't think that a common citizen would know that the Green Berets were available to track down missing boys in the mountains. You know, every other time you'd hear about a disappearance, hey, the National Guard was called out by the governor, and the governor authorized them to help search. The idea that Green Beret is used to find a missing boy is really unusual. And in all the cases I researched, the Legg and Martin cases stand out because of this. And if you look at the mountain range that flows up, starting with Martin's in the Great Smoky Mountains, and you follow that line straight up to the northeast, it isn't unfathomable that that line of continuation of force just continues right onto that area of the Adirondacks in the New York area. And it's just not a cluster per se. It's a cluster in time and space, and it's one of the tightest clusters I write about in the books. And it's in the far southwestern corner of the strait in the city of Bennington. And not only is it unusual because of the dates and the times, but the cases themselves are very weird. It's between 1926 and 1950. 7 people vanished. And first one I'll talk about is Paula Weldon, and she was going to a college there in Bennington. Good student, parents lived close by. She was doing a job in the dorm on a Sunday. Decided she was going to take a walk out to a place called Glastonbury Mountain. And she went out there, and people saw her on the hike up towards the top of the mountain. And they talked to her, and she asked how long it was going to take. She was by herself, and they lost sight of her. Well, people down at the bottom of the mountain later on, it wasn't too far later, heard screams. And the screams were coming from a lower portion of the mountain near a swamp area. Searchers went back into that area, and they smelled a foul odor near the area of the swamp that wasn't consistent with the swamp, and almost thought that it was a dead body smell, but they could never find it. To make a long story short, Paula was never found. But Glastonbury Mountain to the Native Americans has significance because there was a lot of evil things that happened in that area, and they didn't feel safe many times traveling through there. And we found that on a historical search. Going back to 1937, this is probably a story you will never hear anywhere else. August 16th, 1937, Alice Baker was 20 months old and staying in a mountain home just on the outskirts of Bennington. This is a very, very remote area. You drive probably 5 or 6 miles from downtown Bennington. You're in the middle of nowhere, and there's probably a home, every 4 or 5 miles. Except there were 2 cabins pretty close to each other, 100 yards apart. Mrs. Baker needed something at the adjoining cabin. She left Alice alone for maybe 10 minutes. She comes back to the cabin, and her 20-month-old daughter's gone. Huge search. They call in everybody they can. They look. 4 days later, they find her a mile and a half from the cabin inside of a bush. The sheriff at the time said he believed that the girl was kidnapped, but he couldn't figure out how, why, or who did it. And the mom from the very beginning said there's no way my daughter could even get out of the cabin to do that. So who could have been watching the cabin while she left and had the opportunity to take the daughter? That's what was just baffling. And I heard that many times from people, especially around the Great Smoky Mountains. They said, hey, no, people don't come around here and do those kind of things because we won't call the police. We'll take care of it ourselves. And everybody knows that. And then the reality of it is that if you were going to take a child, why would you take her half a mile and put her in a bush? It was just so odd. And it falls within this time frame. And this is another case. Paul Jepson, another 8-year-old boy, is with his mom. And the Jepsons own the right to have their pigs scavenge an area of the city dump adjacent to the forest line. And every couple days, Mrs. Jepson would go out there and move the fence that the pigs were into a different area of the dump. And their son, Paul, would sit in the truck while the mom did this. So the mom's moving the fence, comes back, Paul's gone. Well, they think maybe there was a small avalanche in the dump, but they figured that was wrong. Then they figured that the son might have walked up into the mountains, but it was almost straight up into the mountains right next to the dump. They didn't think that could happen. Paul Jepson was never found. And there's other cases equally strange in Vermont involving people who die and are found in areas that don't make any sense at all. And they all fall within this 1926 to 1950 time frame. And then it's like something happened, the book was shut, nothing more happens. So the question is, there were 7 people I wrote about that disappeared in that time frame. Well, so why in those 24 years would this all of a sudden stop? And then you start to look at the time frames that the disappearance is there versus in Pennsylvania, it went from 1929 to 1957. Vermont, it goes from 1926 to 1950. And you start to think, what was happening in that time period that caused all this chaos and kids disappearing? And then why all of a sudden would it have stopped? I've had hundreds and hundreds of people ask what my opinion on this is, and honestly, I can say that I don't think there's a clear answer to it. It's such a perplexing dilemma of circumstances that I don't think one answer completely fits. I've had 10-page emails come from MUFON directors saying that I've solved the equation on alien abduction. I've had people in the cryptozoology world say, oh, Dave, you finally figured out one of the interesting dilemmas as to what's going on here. And the truth, the more I'm involved in this, the less clear everything becomes. There's a guy, many of you haven't heard of this person. His name was Ray Crow, and Ray lives up in Oregon. Great, great man. crypto researcher. And when I first started to look at the strangeness that goes on in America, Ray told me, Dave, the more you learn, the less you'll understand. I could guarantee that what we're talking about tonight, the more I learn and the more I start to think I know, the less I truly understand. Well, I wrote about stories up in Michigan area where a girl disappears, and a small girl. And she's taken, and her dad and other hunters look for days for her. And they finally find her. And as they come up on her, they see a big dark creature jump into the water and swim away. And she's standing on this log, and her dad comes up and goes, "We were calling for you. Why didn't you yell back?" And she says, "Oh, he wouldn't let me do anything." And he goes, "Who?" And she said, "Big dog, wolf." And the dad says, "Big dog, wolf?" And she says, "Yeah, it took my hat off my head and ate it." And this is a girl named Katie Flynn, a famous story out of Michigan. And if you didn't think much of the story, but you looked at the history of the area, you'll notice that there's a lot of sightings of a big dog that does harm to people, and it's kind of folklore in that area. But Katie's story kind of has that ring of truth about it, that a girl so young couldn't come up with such a complex story, coupled with what the witnesses saw. Something really, really weird happened. And then I write about other stories in the East, and I'm talking multiple stories where predominantly it's girls, and there's one story out of Montana, the same thing, where they're in a camp setting or they're in a rural backyard, the child disappears. They're found days later. "Where were you?" "Oh, I was sleeping with the bear." "You were sleeping with the bear?" "Yeah, he took me and he kept me warm at night. And in fact, sometimes they even fed me." Really? And again, you'd think, well, this story can't be true. But then you read 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 of these, and you start to think, well, maybe it's something that we don't quite understand. But then when you talk to bear experts, they say there's no way a bear is going to do that. There's just no way. They said they'll kill the kid, they'll eat the kid, they'll bite the kid, but they're not going to cuddle with the kid. You know, if you look back in the history of almost every tribe in North America, they talk about tribal members that have been taken at certain points. And one of the things that seems to be a consistent thread amongst them is something that'll be near and dear to your heart, and that's a skinwalker. And a skinwalker is something that can transform back and forth between human and animal. And it almost seems as though between good and bad. And they're adamant that these things are real and that they offer a significant threat, and they've existed over the course of history. And if you look back in history and you read books about it, there's some vestige of truth, it appears, to some of this, in at least the author who wrote it, in their minds. And then you talk about crypto creatures. There's books written where they talk about tribal members being taken by different type of crypto creatures from different parts of the U.S., and sometimes they're eaten, sometimes they're taken as a slave, sometimes they're taken for a sex toy, whatever. But these books weren't written with this being named as a suspect, or me even talking about any of these legends. I think it's important for people to understand that these stories are strange enough standing on their own without me imparting my belief system about what may have occurred. And in the hundreds of emails I've had, I've consistently told people that I think my opinion on this probably unimportant. It's more important to understand the historical significance that this has been going on for over 100 years. And there's a consistent element here to that 100-year history. And for some reason, the powers to be aren't willing to admit it's going on, aren't willing to admit that they understand it's going on, and that there's got to be some type of cover-up on this at the federal level, because there's no reason in the rational world why the Park Service wouldn't be